One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Well, this this next section of our segment on discovering your personal food code or finding your ideal diet, it's probably going to go several different segments or episodes within the section because we're at the point now where we're talking about what you eat. We talked about quantity first and how under and overeating can lead into problems, and I gave you what I call the beaches check, which is kind of a self-check and inventory that you can do just to see if your calories are on point. And that is, checking for how is your brain working? What's your energy like? Are you anxious or nervous? Do you have cravings? Do you have hunger? And what's your sleep quantity and quality? Those are areas that are very much energy dependent. It doesn't mean that energy and fuel stability is the only thing that can cause those things to go wrong. But those are areas where we can predictably see energy deficits or excess actually playing out and causing problems. So moving on to this next one, we're going to have to break it up into different sections just because each one of these is fairly complex. So the next digit in our combination lock sequence, if you will, we're using that as a metaphor to understand how to optimize diet for each individual person. And that is what you eat. And that breaks down into three different subcomponents, and that is your macronutrient profile, the quality of the food that you eat, as well as the content. Let's deal with macronutrients first, and I'll remind you that I did cover this briefly in some earlier episodes, but this is a kind of, let's call it evergreen questions or content, because the questions come up all the time, and thankfully the answers really don't change all that much, especially given where we are in modern science right now and what we understand as the impact of different macronutrient choices. But some of these things bear repeating because it does take time to kind of dial that piece in. And so when we talk about macronutrients, we're talking about it in opposition to micronutrients. Micronutrients are things like vitamins and minerals. Macronutrients are going to be things like protein, fat, and carbohydrates. In general, protein is your structure and building nutrient. Even though it does have caloric density, when you eat protein, you're going to get calories out of that. But when we look at fats and carbohydrates, they play more of a role in terms of supplying energy for basal metabolic rate as well as activity and exercise. And so we kind of set protein off to the side a little bit as similar but somewhat distinct in terms of its purpose and its function as compared to carbohydrates and then fats. And so one of the first things that I would suggest you do when you're trying to optimize your own diet, number one, is to start with your calorie target or goal. And that was what we talked about over the last, I think it was 2 or 3 episodes. Next, when we get into setting your macronutrient profile, the first thing you do within that portion of trying to figure out your code is to set how much protein you need. Now, that is going to be entirely dependent on several different variables, including what your goals are. So if your goal is to just carry the minimal amount of muscle mass that we think you need to be healthy, that's one thing. If your goal is to carry a little bit more muscle mass but not necessarily be athletic and strong, that's one thing. And then if your goal is to increase your muscle mass because you want to be stronger, more athletic, more physically independent, that's another thing. And we can even push it a little bit beyond that and say that we can actually optimize fat loss by pushing proteins a little bit higher than even someone who's lifting weights for the purpose of getting bigger and stronger. And so there's kind of a wide spectrum, but let me give you kind of a general statement in terms of consensus of where we are. First of all, let's deal with the minimum amount of protein. Even though the amount of protein that we need on a day-to-day basis is really predicated on biometrics like our gender, our age, our current muscle mass, as well as our activity and goals, there's a minimum threshold that we have to meet in order to make sure that we are still synthesizing muscle protein and we don't get into muscle loss. The number one predictor of aging independence is how much muscle you have and how strong you are. So just having enough muscle and strengthen your legs to get up and down off a chair or off the toilet, to be able to bend over and pick up a bag of groceries, or to walk up a flight of stairs, or to pick something up and raise it over your head. You have to have a certain amount of muscle, and you have to have a certain amount of strength in those muscles to be able to do those things. And so from a minimum standpoint, no matter how big you are, male, female, doesn't really matter, you need to be consuming a minimum of 50 grams of protein per day. Now, it's got nothing to do with any other metric like your body weight or your activity level. The minimum protein intake is going to be 50 grams per day. So that's kind of where we start. Now, that would be appropriate for someone who is, say, maybe 100 pounds and they're trying to maintain their current muscle mass. But beyond that, the math really doesn't work out. So, I'm just over 200 pounds and I try to be active. I lift weights. I do high intensity work. I hike. I do outdoor stuff. In order for me to maintain my muscle mass, there's no way 50 grams of protein is going to do that. If that's all the protein I ate, I would lose a lot of the muscle mass that I have, that I've gained over the years, and my functional capacity would go down as a result of that. Of course, my scale weight would go down typically with that as well. And so I need more because I'm 6 feet tall, say 200 pounds, and I actively use my muscles in ways that require more protein to maintain and repair the muscles based on the activity and the exercise I do. Now, you're probably not my height. You're probably not my weight. You might not even be my gender. None of that is really relevant, because ultimately at the end of the day, if you were trying to optimize your protein intake for baseline health and wellness, regardless of whether you're trying to lose lose body fat and increase muscle mass, or whatever the case is, the current guidelines and recommendations sit around 0.65 to 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if you weigh, I'm just going to keep the math simple, if you weigh 200 pounds and you want to keep things as they are, then you need to eat somewhere around 130 to 140 grams of protein per day, which might sound like a lot to someone who doesn't eat a lot of protein, but to someone who does eat a lot of protein, it's really not all that much. You can get 25 to 35 grams of protein in a 3 to 4 ounce piece of meat or fish. And so maybe 4 of those plus a protein shake during the day, and that's plenty of protein to keep your muscles fueled and to keep your muscles strong, particularly if you're using them in ways that engage that whole muscle protein synthesis mechanism. So let me back up just a little bit again, because the way I like to put things together, again, I like to use stories, images, and allegories or analogies. Think of your total calories as a fulcrum, and your protein content as part of that fulcrum. You kind of set those two things first. And then on top of that fulcrum, you're going to put a teeter-totter. And the teeter-totter can go up on one side or down on the other, but they never both go up or both go down at the same time. And that's really the way that I want you to think about setting or trying to discover your food code in terms of quantity as well as what you eat, quality and content, is that we end up setting our protein levels first, and then we pick either a higher carb, low fat approach, or we pick a higher fat, low carb approach based on different parameters. But it's ultimately important that we set our protein levels first, because not only does it help us to maintain muscle mass and provide amino acids for repair of structural tissue like our cells and cell membranes, etc., but because it does have a caloric intake, it has an impact on your choices of how many carbohydrates and carbohydrate and fat calories that we're taking from the food that we're eating day to day. So if we set our total calorie goals, and from that we take out a little bit that's related to the protein intake that we're using to support our muscle mass, then the remainder from our total calories is then going to be a portion between carbohydrates and fats based on whatever our preference is or whatever our physiological predisposition is. And that's what we're going to do, and we'll pick it up in the next conversation. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.